Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey unlike any other. Not through life, but through the most unforgettable exits in medieval history. The kind of deaths that make you close your eyes, breathe deeply and whisper, how remarkable that really happened. From knights who met their end in the most unexpected ways to kings whose final moments were stranger than any fairy tale, medieval Europe's most epic deaths are often as poetic as they are peacefully tragic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the shadowed halls and blood-soaked battlefields of the medieval world, and then drift back through time to the marble columns of ancient civilizations where death became legend. Let us begin with one of history's most absurd royal deaths, King Martin the Marne of Aragon, who literally died laughing. In an age when kings were expected to die gloriously in battle or peacefully in their beds surrounded by priests, Martin chose a far more unusual exit from this mortal realm. Martin I, known as Martin the Humane, was actually quite a competent ruler who had spent much of his reign dealing with the complex politics of medieval Iberia. He was known for his diplomatic skills, his patronage of learning, and his relatively peaceful approach to governance, a refreshing change in an era when most kings preferred to solve problems with sharp steel and burning villages. But it was this very sense of humour and appreciation for wit that would ultimately prove his undoing. In the year 1410, at the age of 53, King Martin was holding court in Barcelona when his jester, a man whose name history has unfortunately lost, decided to regale the assembled nobles with a particularly ribald tale about a certain bishop's romantic misadventures. The story, by all medieval accounts, was spectacularly inappropriate and hilariously detailed. Martin began to chuckle, then to laugh outright, and then to absolutely lose control. He laughed so hard that he fell from his throne, gasping and wheezing, tears streaming down his face as courtiers looked on in a mixture of amusement and growing alarm. What started as royal merriment became something far more serious as the king's laughter turned to desperate gasping. His face grew red, then purple, as he struggled to catch his breath between waves of uncontrollable mirth. The court physicians rushed to his aid, but medieval medicine had no understanding of the physiological effects of extreme laughter on the cardiovascular system. For 3 days, King Martin lingered between life and death, his body racked by the after-effects of his laughing fit. Some say he continued to chuckle weakly whenever he remembered the jester's tale. Others claim he tried desperately to speak, to issue final commands for his kingdom, but could only manage weak giggles that horrified his assembled nobles. On the 3rd day, Martin the Humane died, leaving behind a kingdom without an heir and a succession crisis that would plague Aragon for years to come. The jester, meanwhile, fled the court and was never seen again, wise enough to realise that being responsible for a king's death, even an accidental one, was not conducive to a long and healthy life. Martin's death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive merriment, though it's worth noting that medieval chroniclers seemed almost proud of their king's unique exit from the world. In an age when most rulers died from poison, sword wounds or disease, dying from laughter was at least original. The funeral was a solemn affair, though several witnesses reported that some mourners had to suppress inappropriate giggles as they remembered the circumstances of their king's demise. Martin was buried with full royal honours, and his tomb bears the inscription, "Here lies Martin the Humane, who found eternal rest through temporal joy." Duke Wilhelm of Brunswick was a man obsessed with the latest innovations in medieval justice, particularly the increasingly sophisticated methods of extracting confessions from suspected criminals. His castle dungeons were filled with the most advanced torture devices of the 12th century, and he took personal pride in staying current with the latest developments in judicial interrogation. Wilhelm was not an unusually cruel man by the standards of his time. He simply believed that efficient justice required efficient tools. He had invested considerable sums in acquiring devices from the most skilled craftsmen across the Holy Roman Empire, viewing them as necessary instruments of proper governance rather than implements of cruelty. Among his most prized possessions was a newly acquired device that had recently arrived from Nuremberg, an Iron Maiden, one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of this notorious contraption. The device was a thing of terrible beauty, crafted from the finest steel with intricate engravings that depicted scenes of divine justice and moral instruction. The Iron Maiden stood nearly 7 feet tall, shaped like a woman with hinged doors, that opened to reveal a hollow interior, lined with carefully positioned spikes. The spikes were precisely placed to pierce vital organs when the doors closed, ensuring a quick death for those condemned to this ultimate punishment. Duke Wilhelm was particularly proud of the device's engineering. The spikes were arranged so that they would penetrate the victim's body without immediately hitting vital organs, allowing for what medieval legal scholars considered an appropriately graduated punishment. The victim would experience several minutes of agony before the final spike found its mark, providing ample time for last-moment confessions or appeals for mercy. On a cold December morning in 1184, Duke Wilhelm decided to personally inspect his newest acquisition before its first official use. A notorious brigand had been captured and was scheduled for execution that afternoon, and Wilhelm wanted to ensure that every mechanism functioned perfectly for what would be a public demonstration of his commitment to justice. Wilhelm opened the Iron Maiden's doors and stepped inside to examine the spike placement, running his hands along the internal mechanisms to check for any defects that might interfere with the device's operation. The craftsmanship was indeed superb. Each spike was perfectly balanced, each hinge moved smoothly, each latch engaged with satisfying precision. What happened next depends on which medieval chronicle you believe. Some say that Wilhelm's cloak caught on an internal mechanism, causing him to lose his balance and fall against a hidden trigger. Others claim that his young squire, standing nearby, accidentally knocked against the external release lever while trying to get a better view of the device's interior. Whatever the cause, the Iron Maiden's doors suddenly slammed shut with Wilhelm, still inside. The mechanical locks engaged automatically, as they were designed to do, and the Duke found himself trapped within his own instrument of justice. His screams echoed through the castle dungeon as the spikes found their mark with the same precision they had been designed to demonstrate on condemned criminals. The castle guards frantically tried to force the doors open, but the Iron Maiden had been built to resist such efforts. The locking mechanism could only be released from outside, and in their panic, none of the guards could remember the proper sequence of levers and catches needed to free their lord. By the time a master craftsman was summoned from the town below, Duke Wilhelm's screams had faded to silence. When they finally opened the device, they found him positioned exactly as the brigand would have been later that day, a victim of his own commitment to efficient justice. The irony was not lost on medieval chroniclers, who saw in Wilhelm's death a clear example of divine justice served by earthly mechanisms. The Iron Maiden was destroyed on the orders of Wilhelm's heir, who declared that no device that had claimed his father's life would ever be used again in the Duchy of Brunswick. King. Henry the Fawn of England was a man of legendary appetites, for power, for knowledge, for women, and most fatally for food. Known as Beauclerk for his unusual literacy, in an age when many nobles could barely sign their names, Henry was also famous throughout his realm for his enormous consumption of rich foods, exotic delicacies, and elaborate feasts that lasted for days. Henry's court was renowned for its culinary sophistication. His kitchens employed dozens of cooks from across Europe, and his table featured delicacies imported from the farthest reaches of the known world. Spices from the Orient, wines from distant vineyards, and exotic meats from far-off lands. If it could be eaten, Henry wanted to taste it. But of all the foods that graced his royal table, none was more prized by the king than lampreys. These, eel-like creatures, considered the height of culinary sophistication in medieval Europe, were Henry's absolute favourite dish. He would consume them in enormous quantities whenever they were available, often to the concern of his physicians, who warned that such rich food was dangerous for a man of his age and constitution. Lampreys were notoriously difficult to digest, their rich, oily flesh requiring strong stomachs and moderate consumption. Medieval doctors understood that these creatures could cause severe digestive distress if eaten in excess, particularly by older individuals whose systems were not equipped to handle such rich fare. Henry, however, was not a man inclined toward moderation in any aspect of his life. When lampreys were in season, he would order them prepared in every conceivable manner, roasted, boiled, baked in pies, served in rich sauces, and accompanied by the finest wines his cellars could provide. In November of 1135, Henry was staying at his hunting lodge in Normandy when word arrived that an exceptionally fine catch of lampreys had been delivered to his kitchens. Despite being 67 years old and suffering from what medieval sources describe as digestive troubles, Henry ordered an elaborate feast centred around his beloved delicacy. The royal cooks outdid themselves, preparing the lampreys in 7 different styles, and presenting them on golden platters surrounded by exotic fruits and accompanied by the most expensive wines in the royal collection. Henry, delighted by the presentation, settled in for what would prove to be his final meal. Witnesses described the king's appetite that evening as truly prodigious, even by his own legendary standards. He consumed lampreys in quantities that amazed even his most gluttonous courtiers, washing down each course with generous draughts of rich wine and calling for more even as his physicians urged moderation. As the evening progressed, Henry began to show signs of distress. His face grew flushed, his breathing became laboured, and he complained of severe abdominal pain. But when his doctors suggested he retire for the evening, Henry waved them away and called for yet another serving of his favourite dish. The king's condition worsened rapidly throughout the night. What had begun as simple indigestion quickly developed into something far more serious as his aged digestive system, overwhelmed by the rich food and wine, began to shut down completely. For a week, Henry lingered between life and death, his body racked by the consequences of his final feast. The lampreys that had brought him such pleasure now caused him agony beyond description, as his system tried desperately to process the enormous quantity of rich food he had consumed. Medieval chroniclers saw Henry's death as a perfect example of divine justice, a king who had lived by appetite dying from appetite's excess. His physicians pronounced the cause of death as a surfeit of lampreys, a diagnosis that became one of the most famous in medieval medical history. Henry's death created an immediate succession crisis, as his legitimate heir had died in the White Ship disaster years earlier. The lamprey feast, that had seemed like a moment of royal pleasure, became the catalyst for a civil war that would ravage England for decades to come. Pope Sylvester II, born Gerbert of Aurillac, was perhaps the most brilliant mind of the early medieval period, a mathematician, astronomer, inventor, and philosopher, whose learning was so advanced that his contemporaries seriously believed he had made a pact with the devil himself to acquire such impossible knowledge. Gerbert's reputation for supernatural learning was not entirely undeserved. He had studied in the Islamic schools of Spain, where he encountered mathematical and astronomical concepts that were completely unknown in Christian Europe. He brought back with him the Arabic numeral system, advanced techniques in geometry, and astronomical instruments that seemed like magic to his medieval contemporaries. His inventions were equally miraculous by medieval standards. He created mechanical clocks that kept accurate time, built hydraulic organs that produced music without human intervention, and constructed astronomical devices that could predict eclipses and planetary movements with uncanny accuracy. To people who lived in a world of water clocks and sundials, such devices seemed impossible without supernatural assistance. When Gerbert became Pope Sylvester II in 999, the rumours of his demonic connections only intensified. How else could a simple monk from rural France have risen to the highest position in Christendom except through infernal assistance? His enemies whispered that he had traded his soul for knowledge and power, and that the devil would eventually come to collect his due. Gerbert himself seemed aware of these rumours, and being a man of considerable wit, sometimes played into them. For his own amusement, he would make cryptic references to my teacher when discussing his advanced learning, and would smile mysteriously when asked about the source of his remarkable inventions. According to the most popular legend, Gerbert had indeed made a bargain with the devil during his youth in Spain. In exchange for unparalleled learning and guaranteed advancement to the papal throne, he had promised his soul, but with a clever caveat. The devil could only claim him if he ever said Mass in Jerusalem. Gerbert, confident in his cleverness, believed he had outwitted the Prince of Darkness. After all, Jerusalem was far away, held by Muslim armies, and there was no reason for a pope to travel there. He had, he thought, gained eternal knowledge and temporal power, while keeping his soul safely beyond Satan's reach. For years, this strategy seemed to work perfectly. Gerbert rose through the church hierarchy with unprecedented speed, his reputation for learning opening doors that remained closed to other ambitious clerics. His inventions and innovations brought glory to the church and amazement to the faithful. The devil, apparently, was keeping his end of the bargain while waiting patiently for Gerbert to fulfill his. The fatal mistake came on a seemingly ordinary day in 1003. Pope Sylvester II was saying Mass in the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, one of the 7 pilgrimage churches of Rome. The church bore this name because it housed relics brought from the actual Jerusalem by St. Helena, Constantine's mother. As Gerbert elevated the host during the consecration, he suddenly realised his error. He was indeed saying Mass in Jerusalem, not the physical city, but a church that bore its name and contained its sacred relics. According to medieval logic, this was sufficient to fulfill the literal terms of his bargain with the devil. Witnesses described what happened next in terms that vary depending on which chronicle you believe. Some say that Gerbert suddenly cried out in recognition of his doom and collapsed at the altar. Others claim that he began to bleed from his hands and feet, stigmata-like wounds appearing as the devil marked him for collection. The most dramatic account describes the appearance of a dark figure in the church who spoke in a voice like thunder, reminding Gerbert of their ancient bargain and declaring that the time of payment had come. The Pope allegedly tried to argue the technicality, pointing out that Santa Croce was not the actual Jerusalem, but the devil reportedly replied that clever men should be more careful with their words. Gerbert died within hours of the incident, though the exact cause of death was never determined. His body showed no signs of violence, poison, or disease. He simply died, as if his life force had been withdrawn by supernatural means. In death, Gerbert's reputation remained complicated. The church recognised his contributions to learning and governance, but also worried about the implications of rumours regarding his supernatural connections. He was buried quietly, and many of his inventions were destroyed or hidden away, considered too dangerous for continued use. King Henry II of France was the embodiment of medieval knightly virtue, even though he lived in the Renaissance age when such ideals were becoming increasingly obsolete. He was passionate about tournaments, jousting, and the elaborate ceremonies of chivalric combat that had defined noble culture for centuries. Henry's love of jousting was legendary throughout Europe. Despite being the king of the most powerful nation in Christendom, he regularly participated in tournaments, both as a way to maintain his martial skills and to demonstrate the royal commitment to knightly values that his subjects expected from their monarch. The king's skill with lance and sword was considerable, honed through years of practice and actual combat experience. He had fought in real wars and understood the deadly reality behind the pageantry of tournament combat, but like many nobles of his era, Henry found the controlled violence of the joust preferable to the chaos of actual battlefield warfare. In Tihu, June of 1559, Henry organised a magnificent tournament to celebrate the recent Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which had ended the long war between France and the Habsburg powers. The tournament was to be the crowning achievement of his reign, a demonstration of French power and royal magnificence that would be remembered for generations. The lists were erected in the Rue Saint-Antoine in Paris, decorated with the finest tapestries and surrounded by elaborate pavilions for the nobility. Knights from across Europe came to participate, attracted by the substantial prizes and the honour of competing before the French king himself. Henry intended to participate actively in the tournament, despite the concerns of his advisers and the fears of his wife, Catherine de' Medici, who had reportedly been troubled by prophetic dreams warning of her husband's death in combat. But Henry dismissed such concerns as women's superstitions and continued with his preparations. On the final day of the tournament, Henry faced Gabriel de Lorges, Count of Montgomery, captain of the King's own Scottish Guard. Montgomery was a skilled knight and an experienced jouster, but he was also reluctant to face his king in combat, understanding the political dangers of accidentally injuring the monarch. The first pass went well, with both knights striking solid blows against their opponent's shield without causing injury. The crowd cheered enthusiastically, delighted by the high quality of the combat and the obvious skill of both participants. But Henry, exhilarated by the combat and the crowd's approval, insisted on a second pass despite the fact that honour had already been satisfied. Montgomery again expressed reluctance, but the king commanded the joust to continue, and no knight could refuse a direct royal order. The second pass proved fatal. Both knights struck true, their lances splintering against their opponent's armour with tremendous force. But while Henry's lance broke cleanly, Montgomery's shattered in an unusual way, sending a large splinter upward toward the king's helmet. The splinter penetrated the visor of Henry's helmet, which was raised slightly to improve his vision, and drove directly into his right eye. The force of the impact drove the wooden fragment deep into the king's brain, causing massive trauma that medieval medicine was completely unable to treat. Henry was carried from the lists unconscious and bleeding, surrounded by horrified courtiers, and physicians who recognised immediately that the wound was mortal. For 10 days, the king lingered between life and death as the finest medical minds in Europe tried desperately to save him. The irony of Henry's death was not lost on contemporary observers. Here was a king who had survived real warfare, political assassination attempts, and the countless dangers of 16th century monarchy, only to die in what was meant to be ceremonial combat designed for entertainment and honour. Montgomery fled France immediately after the accident, knowing that he would be blamed for the king's death regardless of the circumstances. He eventually converted to Protestantism and fought against the French crown in the religious wars that followed, perhaps seeing Henry's death as a sign of divine judgment against Catholic France. Henry's death marked the end of an era in French history. His sons, who succeeded him, lacked both his political skill and his commitment to traditional knightly values. The tournament that was meant to celebrate French power instead became the symbol of its decline, as the kingdom descended into the religious civil wars that would plague it for the next generation. Prince Tancred of Hauteville was one of the greatest Norman knights of the crusading era, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of Muslim armies and inspired fierce loyalty among his Christian followers. As Prince of Antioch, he had carved out a principality in the harsh lands of northern Syria through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and the kind of relentless determination that characterized the Norman conquest wherever they went. Tancred had arrived in the Holy Land as part of the First Crusade, fighting alongside his uncle Bohemond in the long and brutal siege of Antioch. When Bohemond was captured by the Danish Mende Turks, Tancred assumed control of the principality and proved himself more than capable of holding the strategic city against all comers. For more than a decade, Tancred had defended Antioch against repeated Muslim attempts to recapture it. His military tactics were innovative and ruthless, combining traditional Norman heavy cavalry charges with lessons learned from fighting in the desert climate of the Middle East. He had adapted to local conditions in ways that many Crusader lords never managed, learning Arabic, studying Muslim military techniques, and even adopting some aspects of Eastern dress and customs. But by 1112, the constant warfare was taking its toll on both Tancred and his principality. The Normans who had conquered Antioch were dying off, either in battle or from the various diseases that plagued Europeans living in the Middle Eastern climate. Recruitment from Europe had slowed, as enthusiasm for the Crusades waned, and Tancred found himself commanding an increasingly small force of knights supported by local Christian and Muslim auxiliaries. The end came not in glorious battle, as Tancred might have preferred, but through the slow grinding warfare of siege and counter-siege that characterised much of Crusader military activity. The Muslim Atabeg Maudud of Mosul had assembled a large army and was methodically reducing the outlying fortresses that protected Antioch's territory. Tancred, though suffering from what contemporary sources describe as a wasting illness, possibly dysentery or typhoid fever, both common killers in the medieval Middle East, insisted on personally leading the defence of his principality. Against the advice of his physicians and the pleas of his knights, he donned his armour and rode out to face the Muslim army. The battle that followed was typical of the desperate actions that marked the later Crusades. Tancred's forces were heavily outnumbered, but they had the advantage of superior armour and the fierce motivation of men fighting for their homes and their faith. The Norman knights charged with their traditional fury, smashing through the Muslim lines and causing significant casualties. But medieval warfare was as much about endurance as courage, and Tancred's weakened condition soon began to tell. Witnesses described seeing the prince swaying in his saddle, held upright only by his will and the support of his mail hauberk. His face, visible through his helmet's visor, was deathly pale, and foam flecked his lips as he struggled to breathe. Despite his condition, Tancred continued to fight with the skill that had made him legendary throughout the Middle East. His sword work remained precise, his tactical decisions sound, and his presence continued to inspire his men to feats of desperate courage. But as the day wore on, it became clear that his body was failing even as his spirit remained strong. The end came as the sun was setting over the Syrian hills. Tancred, leading a final charge against a group of Muslim heavy cavalry, suddenly collapsed from his horse. His knights rushed to protect him, but it was clear that the prince was dying. His last words, according to the chronicler Albert of Aachen, were a prayer for the safety of Antioch and its people. Tancred's death marked the effective end of Norman expansion in the Middle East. His successors lacked both his military genius and his understanding of local conditions, and within a generation, most of the territory he had conquered was back in Muslim hands. The Principality of Antioch would survive for another century, but it would never again be the powerful state that Tancred had created. Jacques Coeur was perhaps the wealthiest merchant in all of medieval Europe, a man who had risen from humble beginnings as the son of a furrier to become the financial advisor to kings and the master of a commercial empire that stretched from France to the Levant. His story was one of medieval capitalism at its most successful and most dangerous. Born in Bourges around 1395, Jacques had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd trading, political connections, and what his enemies claimed were distinctly unscrupulous business practices. He traded in everything that medieval commerce could provide: spices from the Orient, silks from Byzantium, precious metals from the mines of Central Europe, and exotic goods from the farthest reaches of the known world. By the 1440s, Jacques Coeur had become indispensable to the French crown. King Charles VII relied on his loans to finance military campaigns, his ships to transport royal goods, and his international connections to maintain diplomatic relations with distant powers. Jacques had been ennobled, granted vast estates, and given positions of trust that would have been unthinkable for a merchant's son in earlier centuries. But success bred enemies, and Jacques had many. Traditional nobles resented his rapid rise, and his influence over the king. Competing merchants envied his monopolies and his political protection. Church officials disapproved of his dealings with Muslim traders and his apparent disregard for traditional restrictions on Christian commerce. The conspiracy against Jacques began to coalesce around accusations that his wealth had been gained through treasonous dealings with France's enemies. His accusers claimed that he had been selling military supplies to the Muslims who were fighting French allies in the Mediterranean, and that his commercial operations were actually elaborate spy networks designed to benefit foreign powers. The specific charge that ultimately brought Jacques down was that he had poisoned Agnès Sorel, King Charles VII's mistress, and one of the most powerful women in France. Agnès had died suddenly in 1450, and her death had been attributed to natural causes. But Jacques' enemies now claimed that he had administered a slow-acting poison at the request of foreign agents who wanted to weaken the king's resolve. Evidence against Jacques was largely circumstantial, but in medieval justice, circumstantial evidence combined with motivated accusers was often sufficient for conviction. Jacques had been present at court when Agnès fell ill, He had access to exotic substances through his trading networks, and his financial interests potentially conflicted with French foreign policy. More damaging still was the testimony of former associates who claimed that Jacques had spoken openly of his contempt for traditional French nobility and his belief that merchants like himself were better qualified to rule than hereditary lords. In an age when social hierarchy was considered divinely ordained, such statements were tantamount to treason. King Charles VII, faced with overwhelming pressure from his nobles and lacking the political strength to defend his financial advisor, reluctantly authorised Jacques' arrest. The merchant was seized at his palace in Bourges and transported to the royal prison at Poitiers, where he was subjected to the kind of interrogation that medieval justice reserved for traitors. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Jacques' wealth, which had protected him for so long, now became evidence of his guilt. How could a simple merchant have acquired such riches except through treasonous dealings? His international connections, once valuable to the crown, were now proof of his disloyalty to France. Faced with certain conviction and probable execution, Jacques chose what many medieval prisoners in his position selected. He confessed to crimes he may or may not have committed in exchange for a commutation of his death sentence. He was stripped of his properties, banned from France, and sent into exile with only the clothes on his back. But Jacques' enemies were not content with mere exile. They wanted his complete destruction, and they achieved it through the most medieval of methods: poison. In 1456, while staying on the island of Chios as a guest of Genoese merchants, Jacques suddenly fell ill after drinking from a golden chalice that had been presented to him as a gesture of hospitality. The poison worked slowly, giving Jacques time to realise what was happening and to understand that his enemies had finally succeeded in reaching him even in distant exile. He died in agony, far from the France he had served and enriched, a victim of the same kind of international conspiracy that he had been accused of orchestrating. Jacques Coeur's death marked the end of an era in medieval commerce, the age when individual merchants could rise to positions of quasi-royal power was passing, replaced by the more regulated and state-controlled capitalism of the Renaissance. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of rising too high above one's birth, but also a testament to the possibilities that medieval commerce offered to those bold enough to seize them. Peter Abelard was the most brilliant mind of Guy, the 12th century, a philosopher and theologian whose ideas challenged the very foundations of medieval Christian thought. He was also, tragically, a man whose intellectual achievements would be forever overshadowed by a love affair that scandalised medieval Europe and led to one of the most poetic and devastating deaths in the history of scholarship. Born in Brittany, around 1079, Abelard had demonstrated exceptional intellectual gifts from an early age. He studied under the greatest masters of his time, quickly surpassing his teachers in dialectical skill and theological insight. By his 30s, he was the most famous teacher in Paris, drawing students from across Europe to hear his lectures on logic, theology, and philosophy. Abelard's teaching methods were revolutionary for their time. Rather than simply repeating established authorities, he encouraged his students to question, to debate, and to think independently about theological matters. His work, Sic et Non, presented contradictory statements from church fathers and challenged readers to reconcile them through reason rather than mere acceptance of authority. This approach made Abelard many enemies among traditional churchmen, who saw his methods as dangerous to established doctrine and proper religious authority. But it also made him incredibly popular with students and progressive thinkers who were hungry for a more rational approach to questions of faith and philosophy. The tragedy began when Abelard became tutor to Héloïse, the brilliant niece of Canon Fulbert of Notre Dame. Héloïse was herself a remarkable woman, one of the most learned females of her age, fluent in Latin and Greek, and capable of engaging with the most complex philosophical questions of the time. What was meant to be an intellectual relationship quickly became something deeper and more dangerous. Abelard and Héloïse fell passionately in love, conducting their affair with the intensity that might be expected from two of the most brilliant minds of their generation. Their love letters, which survive to this day, reveal a relationship of extraordinary intellectual and emotional depth. When Héloïse became pregnant, the scandal could no longer be contained. Abelard proposed marriage, but Héloïse refused, arguing that marriage would destroy his career in the church and reduce their love to mere social convention. Eventually, they were secretly married, but Canon Fulbert, feeling dishonoured by the affair, hired thugs who broke into Abelard's lodgings and castrated him. The physical mutilation was devastating enough, but the psychological and social consequences were even worse. In medieval society, a castrated man was considered fundamentally diminished, unable to fulfill the basic requirements of masculine identity. For someone like Abelard, whose sense of self was so closely tied to his intellectual and physical vigour, the assault was catastrophic. Abelard retreated to the monastery of Saint-Denis, seeking solace in religious contemplation and scholarly work. Héloïse, despite her own protests, was persuaded to enter the convent of Argenteuil. They would never see each other again, though their correspondence continued for years, creating some of the most moving love letters in medieval literature. But monastic life did not bring Abelard the peace he sought. His continued questioning of established doctrine brought him into conflict with church authorities, culminating in the Council of Sens in 1140, where his teachings were formally condemned as heretical. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful Tensi, churchman of the age, led the campaign against Abelard's ideas. The condemnation was a crushing blow to a man who had devoted his life to understanding divine truth through reason. Abelard appealed to Rome, but Pope Innocent II upheld the council's decision and ordered him to remain silent on theological matters for the rest of his life. Broken in body and spirit, Abelard retired to the monastery of Cluny, where he was received with kindness by Abbot Peter the Venerable. But the fire that had driven his intellectual pursuits for so many years was slowly consuming him from within. Contemporary accounts describe him as wasting away, consumed by an internal fever that no medieval medicine could treat. Peter the Venerable later wrote that Abelard's final days were marked by intense mystical experiences, as if the rational philosopher was finally making direct contact with the divine truths he had spent his life trying to understand through logic and argument. He died on April 21st, 1142, reportedly with Héloïse's name on his lips. Abelard's body was secretly transported to Héloïse's convent, where she arranged for his burial. When she died 21 years later, she was buried beside him, fulfilling in death the union that had been denied them in life. Their shared tomb became a pilgrimage site for lovers and scholars alike, a testament to the power of both intellectual passion and human love. Master William of Sens was the greatest architect of his age, a man whose vision and skill had transformed the art of cathedral building and whose innovations would influence church architecture for centuries to come. He was also, ultimately, a victim of his own ambition and the dangerous heights to which medieval cathedral builders literally aspired. William had earned his reputation through his work on the great Cathedral of Sens, where he had pioneered new techniques in Gothic architecture that allowed for higher walls, larger windows, and more complex stone vaulting than had ever been attempted before. His innovations in flying buttresses and pointed arches made possible the soaring spaces and divine light that became the hallmarks of Gothic design. In 1174, William was summoned to England to rebuild the choir of Canterbury Cathedral, which had been severely damaged by fire. The opportunity was irresistible. Canterbury was one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe, and rebuilding its cathedral would cement William's reputation as the premier architect of his generation. William's design for Canterbury was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in England. He planned a choir that would rise higher than any church in the kingdom, supported by revolutionary new techniques in stone construction that he had perfected during his work in France. The project would require unprecedented precision in engineering and absolute perfection in execution. For 4 years, William supervised every aspect of the construction, personally overseeing the placement of each stone and the carving of each capital. His attention to detail was legendary among the craftsmen who worked under him, Nothing was too small to escape his notice, no detail too minor to warrant his personal involvement. The work was proceeding magnificently. The new choir was beginning to take shape, its soaring arches and delicate stonework, proving that William's revolutionary techniques could indeed create spaces that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity and engineering. But on September 11th, 1178, disaster struck. William was inspecting the scaffolding high above the choir floor, checking the placement of stones in the uppermost reaches of the vault, when the wooden platform beneath him suddenly gave way. Whether it was faulty construction, overloading, or simple age that caused the collapse, no one ever determined. William fell 50 feet to the stone floor below, his body striking the very stones he had so carefully positioned. The impact was devastating. His spine was shattered, his legs crushed, and internal injuries left him unable to move. But perhaps most tragically of all, his mind remained perfectly clear, allowing him to understand exactly what had happened and what it meant for both his life and his great work. For months, William lingered in agony, unable to walk, but still, trying to direct the work on his cathedral from his sickbed. He would have himself carried to the construction site on a litter, propped up so he could see the progress and give instructions to his master masons. But his body was failing rapidly, and his craftsmen could see that their brilliant master was dying before their eyes. The psychological torment was perhaps worse than the physical pain. William knew that he would never see his masterpiece completed, never witness the moment when light first flooded through the great windows he had designed, never hear the first mass sung in the choir he had envisioned. The cathedral that was meant to be his monument had become his tomb. William of Sens died in early 1180, 2 years after his fall, his great work still unfinished. The cathedral was eventually completed by another William, William the Englishman, but it would forever bear the mark of its original architect's vision and sacrifice. Canterbury Cathedral still stands today, a testament to the man who literally gave his life for his art, and whose fall from grace became as much a part of his legacy as his rise to architectural immortality. As we drift deeper into this peaceful exploration of history's most remarkable exits, let us now journey back through the mists of time, from the stone halls of medieval Europe to the marble columns and olive groves of the ancient world, where death became legend and legends became eternal whispers in the corridors of memory. Let's begin our ancient journey with Mithridates VI, king, warrior, master of languages, and a man so paranoid he essentially turned himself into a living science experiment. Ruling the kingdom of Pontus in the 1st century BCE, Mithridates lived in constant fear of assassination, which, to be fair, was a pretty rational fear for ancient monarchs. Poison was the ancient world's preferred method of political problem-solving. Quick, easy, and very much in fashion at royal dinner parties, so what did he do? He started microdosing everything that could kill him. Hemlock, a pinch; arsenic, a dash; belladonna, just a taste. Over time, he built up what was believed to be near-total immunity. His personal apothecaries even created a legendary antidote, called the Mithridatium, a cure-all concoction so potent medieval doctors were still trying to replicate it over 1,000 years later. This man didn't just eat food, he dared it to try anything. But then came Rome. They didn't care about his science project. Rome wanted Pontus. And after a series of bloody conflicts, Mithridates found himself cornered. Betrayed, surrounded, and facing capture, the proud king decided he wouldn't give his enemies the satisfaction of parading him through the streets of Rome in chains. He reached for the poison, his old faithful friend, and nothing. After years of carefully inoculating himself against death, he was immune to dying, at least the quiet, elegant kind. Like a chef who couldn't be burned, or a fish who forgot how to drown, Mithridates had outplayed his own exit strategy. With Romans breaking down the gates, he turned to one of his mercenaries and essentially said, "All right, plan B, do it manually." And just like that, the king who outsmarted poisons fell to a good old-fashioned sword thrust. Sometimes death doesn't need to be clever, just consistent. Mithridates went down in history as the man who couldn't be killed chemically, but could still be stabbed like everyone else. It's almost poetic, really. A reminder that no matter how well you plan, fate always keeps a rusty blade nearby just in case. The king who feared poison died by steel, the scholar who mastered chemistry fell to physics, and the man who conquered death in a laboratory discovered that mortality always finds another door. Our next tale begins with a Viking, and like all good Viking stories, it includes beheading, bravado, and dental revenge. Meet Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty, a Norse earl ruling over the Orkney Islands in the 9th century. Fierce in battle, proud of his conquests, and apparently not one for subtlety. Sigurd had a bit of a rivalry with a Scottish noble named Malbrighty the Bucktoothed, which yes is a real nickname, and yes it will become disturbingly relevant. Tired of the back and forth, Sigurd challenged Bricta to a battle, each bringing 40 men. But Sigurd, in true Viking fashion, cheated. He brought 80. The math was not in Bricta's favour. The result, total massacre. Sigurd beheaded Bricta in the Alim chaos, and in a bold move that can only be described as extra, tied the severed head to his saddle as a trophy on his victory ride home. This is where things go south. As Sigurd galloped through the countryside, feeling like a war god, Bricta's head bumped along beside him, swinging against the horse, and as fate would have it, one of Bricta's famously large teeth scraped Sigurd's leg. Just a scratch. Nothing to worry about, right? Wrong. This was the 9th century. There were no antibiotics, no neosporin, not even a bandage. The wound became infected. Sigurd fell ill, and within days he died. That's right, he was killed by the tooth of a man he had already beheaded. Bricta didn't win the battle, but he definitely won the grudge match. It's the kind of story that feels like it belongs in a myth. A warrior punished for arrogance, felled by the smallest, most ironic detail, a literal bite from the past. And while Viking sagas are often filled with dramatic deaths, flaming, ships and curses from angry gods, few are as poetically absurd as this one. Sigurd rode home thinking he had won. Instead, he became the punchline in one of history's most bizarre obituaries. So let that be a lesson. Even in victory, check your saddle, and maybe don't strap enemy heads to your horse. You never know what teeth are plotting. The story spread throughout the Norse world, becoming a cautionary tale about hubris and the unexpected ways fate can strike. In the halls of Vikings, where bravery was everything and death in battle was the highest honour, Sigurd's death was both embarrassing and strangely admirable, killed not by a superior warrior, but by the lingering defiance of a defeated enemy. Let's talk about Pyrrhus of Epirus, a man so good at winning battles that he lost entire wars just proving the point. This was no minor noble. Pyrrhus was the cousin of Alexander the Great, a military prodigy, and a persistent thorn in the side of Rome. He was known for Pyrrhic victories. That's when you technically win, but lose so much doing it that you might as well have stayed home and done laundry. After years of exhausting campaigns, heroic charges, and shouting at elephants to do what they were told, Pyrrhus ended up in Argos, trying to sort out yet another Greek political mess. It was, late, he was tired. But honour and bad decisions demanded one more battle. So in the dead of night, Pyrrhus led his troops into the city. But this wasn't a grand cinematic entrance. His elephants got stuck in narrow streets. His soldiers got lost. And by morning, Pyrrhus, the great general, was sword-fighting random enemies in an alley like a drunken tourist in armour. Now here's where fate sharpens its comedy pencil. Above the street, an elderly woman watched the chaos unfold from her rooftop. We don't know her name, but we do know this. She had opinions and a roof tile, and she decided it was time to participate. With the casual accuracy of someone who had clearly thrown a few things before, probably at chickens, grandchildren, or other invading kings, she dropped the tile. Direct hit. The ceramic shingle clonked Pyrrhus on the head. He fell to the ground like a sack of old turnips. One of the enemy soldiers, either confused or opportunistic, rushed over and finished him off. Just like that, the man who survived, Roman legions, Macedonian politics, and his own ego was taken out by a Greek grandma and basic building supplies. No epic final duel, no glorious charge, just a fatal encounter with bad roof maintenance. There's no statue for the woman, no official medal for best use of architectural debris in urban combat, but honestly there should be. And Pyrrhus, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how big your army is, gravity always wins. The irony wasn't lost on ancient historians. Here was a man who had studied under the greatest military minds, who had conquered cities and defeated armies, who had made Rome itself tremble, and he was felled by a piece of fired clay thrown by someone who probably couldn't even read. It was the kind of death that ancient playwrights would have rejected as too absurd for tragedy and too meaningful for comedy. Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic, healer, and beard enthusiast, whose death has become the gold standard for overkill. Now Rasputin was a problem, not just politically but cosmically. He was like that one guy at a party who won't leave, won't stop talking about his spiritual visions, and has somehow hypnotized the host's wife and all her friends. Only in this case, the host was Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, and the party was a crumbling monarchy. Naturally, the Russian nobility wanted him gone. Politely at first, but Rasputin didn't do subtle, so they moved on to murder. Plan A, poison. They baked him a cake and poured enough cyanide into it to take out a village. Rasputin ate it, smiled, and asked for more. At this point, someone probably started sweating, so they moved to Plan B. Shoot him, which they did in the chest. Rasputin dropped. Success. They leaned in to confirm. Bad move. He sat up like a horror movie villain and started yelling. This is the part where someone definitely screamed and dropped a glass. So Plan C, shoot him again, multiple times. He went down again, but still not quite done. Rasputin then crawled across the floor, allegedly trying to flee the palace. Because why not? It's not like bullets had ever stopped him before. By now the assassins were running out of ideas, so they bound him up, dragged him to the river, and threw him into the frozen Neva. You know, just to be thorough. And here's the final twist. When his body was found downstream, his hands were reportedly clawing at the ice, which implies he was still alive underwater, trying to escape. Because of course he was. It took poison, gunfire, blunt force trauma, and drowning to finally end Rasputin. If they'd tried stabbing him with garlic or driving a stake through his heart, no one would have even blinked. So what do we learn here? Never underestimate a man with terrible hygiene, questionable theology, and skin apparently made of iron. The mad monk's death became legend, not just in Russia, but around the world, spawning countless books, movies, and songs. People still debate whether the stories are exaggerated, but the basic facts remain. It took multiple assassination attempts, several different methods, and an entire night to kill one very determined mystic. Rasputin's death marked the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty. Within months, revolution would sweep through Russia, and the royal family he had both served and scandalized would meet their own tragic end. But Rasputin went first, dying as dramatically as he had lived, taking multiple curtain calls before finally accepting that the show was over. Our next exit comes courtesy of Chrysippus of Soli, a Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece who spent his life contemplating logic, ethics, and apparently livestock. Now, Stoic philosophers were known for their seriousness. They taught emotional restraint, rational thought, and enduring hardship with a stiff upper lip. But Chrysippus, he went out laughing, literally. One afternoon, while doing whatever ancient philosophers did between lectures, likely pacing dramatically in a toga, Chrysippus noticed something odd. A donkey eating figs. That's it. That's the scene. But Chrysippus, clearly in a mood, turned to a servant and said, "Give that donkey a drink of wine to wash down the figs." And that's when it happened. He began to laugh, and he didn't stop. Not a polite chuckle, not a philosopher's smirk, but a full-blown, chest-rattling, wheezing, gasping, tears in the eyes, laughing fit that ended in death. Yes, the man who could. Lecture for hours about the nature of the universe died, because he thought a donkey eating fruit and sipping wine was too funny to live through. To be clear, this wasn't the first time ancient Greek philosophers died in bizarre ways. One supposedly choked on a fig, another fell into a well while stargazing. But Chrysippus truly committed to the bit. Imagine the scene. Scholars gathered around, ready for another lesson in virtue, only to find their teacher sprawled on the floor, still smiling, possibly mid-giggle. Not exactly the legacy Plato had in mind. There's something beautifully ironic about a Stoic, someone whose entire life was about controlling emotion, being undone by a single punchline. It's like if a fire safety instructor went out juggling matches near a curtain, and what a legacy. People might forget your theories on metaphysics, but the guy who died laughing at his own donkey joke, that'll be passed down for centuries. Some say laughter is the best medicine. In this case, it was definitely not. The story of Chrysippus became a favourite among ancient writers, who saw in it a perfect example of how even the wisest among us can be undone by the most human of responses. Here was a man who had written extensively about the rational soul, about the importance of living according to nature, about accepting whatever fate brings with equanimity, and he died in a fit of uncontrollable mirth over a drunk donkey. His students, presumably, had to figure out how to incorporate this into their understanding of Stoic doctrine. How do you explain that your teacher, who preached emotional control, died from laughing too hard? Perhaps the lesson was that even philosophers are human, or maybe that joy, when it comes, should be embraced fully, even if it kills you. Meetshöher. Franz Reichelt, a man of vision, a man of ambition, a man who thought, why should only birds have all the fun? Franz was an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris in the early 20th century. But he didn't just sew suits, he wanted to sew history. His idea, a wearable parachute. That's right, Franz dreamed of designing a coat that could transform into wings. Fashion meets aviation. Early aviation was still a mess at this point, with planes that looked like flying kites and crashes being more common than landings. So Franz figured if pilots had to go down, at least they could glide down in style. After many attempts, tests and prototypes, most of which ended with crash dummies plummeting into the ground, Franz was ready. Or at least, he thought, he was. Despite friends and authorities begging him not to, he insisted on testing it himself. And what better stage for this dramatic debut than the Eiffel Tower? It was 1912. Franz arrived in full media flair, proudly wearing his flying coat. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled. Even police were there, mostly hoping to stop him, but also somewhat curious. He climbed the tower, waved to the crowd, and stood on the ledge. And then he jumped. The parachute didn't open, not even a little. Franz fell straight down like a tailor-shaped brick and hit the ground at roughly, we don't measure speed in pain, many miles per hour. He died instantly, leaving behind a crater, a twisted coat, and an uncomfortable silence among the spectators. It would have been a tragic end if it weren't also so perfectly ironic. A man who tried to make falling safe by falling. He went out doing what he loved, inventing. Unfortunately, his final prototype also served as his final moment. And as cruel as history can be, it remembers him not as a tailor, not even as an inventor, but as the flying tailor, a man who aimed for the sky and made it to the ground instead. Franz became a cautionary tale about the dangers of testing your own inventions, especially when those inventions involve gravity and hard surfaces. The key footage of his fatal jump still exists, a grainy reminder of one man's courage and miscalculation. Watching it today, you can see him hesitate for a moment on the platform, perhaps realising that this might not go according to plan. But then he jumps anyway, committed to his vision even in the face of almost certain death. His death wasn't entirely in vain. It helped convince aviation authorities that parachute testing should be done with dummies first, actual people second. Franz Reichelt's final flight lasted only a few seconds, but his legacy as a reminder of both human ambition and human folly has lasted over a century. If you thought being a Roman emperor meant eternal glory, flowing togas and grapes served, on silver platters, let me introduce you to Valerian, the only Roman emperor who got captured in battle and then turned into furniture. Valerian ruled during the 3rd century CE, a time when the Roman Empire was cracking like an overcooked lasagna. Plagues, civil wars, barbarian invasions. It was bring your own chaos every year. Still, Valerian tried to hold it all together. One of his main challenges, the Persians, specifically a king named Shapur, who had absolutely no patience for Roman posturing. So Valerian gathered his army and marched east, determined to assert dominance. It did not go well. In the Battle of Edessa, the Roman army was obliterated, and Valerian was taken alive, a rarity back then. Capturing an emperor was like catching a unicorn in a bear trap. You'd think Shapur might ransom him or make a diplomatic power play. Nope. Shapur had a better idea. He used Valerian as a literal human footstool. That's right. Whenever Shapur mounted his horse, he had the former emperor brought out to kneel, beneath his boots, daily, publicly. It's not just humiliation. It's humiliation with choreography. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it did. After years of this royal degradation, Valerian died in captivity. How? The sources disagree, but the most colourful version says Shapur had him skinned, stuffed with straw, and displayed as a war trophy in a Persian temple. A warning to Rome, a triumph for Persia, and let's be honest, a taxidermist's worst day on the job. Rome, of course, was not pleased. They never officially acknowledged Valerian's fate. They acted like he just sort of disappeared. Probably sipping. Wine in retirement, right? Sure. But Valerian's fate stuck in the historical memory. A mighty emperor brought down by hubris, bad strategy, and a king with a very literal sense of humour. The story of Valerian became a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial overreach and the fickleness of fortune. Here was a man who had held absolute power over millions of people, who had commanded legions and lived in unimaginable luxury, reduced to serving as a step-stool for his enemy. It was the kind of dramatic reversal that ancient historians loved, a reminder that pride comes before a fall, sometimes literally. Shapur, for his part, made sure the story spread throughout his empire and beyond. He commissioned rock carvings, showing himself standing triumphantly over kneeling Romans, with Valerian clearly depicted among the defeated. These images, carved into cliffsides in modern-day Iran, still exist today, a 1,800-year-old reminder of one emperor's ultimate humiliation. Say hello to King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, a monarch remembered less for ruling a nation and more for losing a duel with his own dinner. Adolf Frederick reigned during the 18th century, a relatively peaceful time in Swedish history. He wasn't known for waging wars, passing sweeping reforms, or writing philosophical treatises. No, he's famous for eating himself to death. And not metaphorically. This was not a poetic, devoured by ambition situation. This was a literal death by buffet. It was Fat Tuesday 1771, the last day before Lent, a perfect excuse to indulge. And King Adolf did not hold back. According to historical accounts, he consumed lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and 14 servings of his favourite dessert, semla. Now, if you've never had a semla, imagine a cardamom-spiced bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream, floating in warm milk. Delicious, fluffy, deceptively innocent, unless you eat them 14 times in a row, in which case they become a Viking curse in pastry form. After this heroic effort, the king reportedly complained of stomach pains, which, let's be honest, is the politest way history could phrase what must have been a full-body rebellion. Shortly after, he died. Cause of death, digestive problems, they said. In modern terms, we might file that under fatal food regret. Swedish citizens were understandably shocked. One minute you have a king, the next he's been outmanoeuvred by a dessert. Not an assassin, not a rebellion, not a duel, cream and almonds. There's something bizarrely poetic about it, a king indulging himself one last time, taken out by the very luxury that defined his life. The royal court tried to keep it dignified, but history remembers the menu. To this day, Sweden still celebrates Fat Tuesday with semla buns. And yes, every year someone brings up the king who loved them a little too much. Adolf Frederick's death became a source of both national embarrassment and dark humour. Here was a king who had ruled during the Age of Liberty in Swedish politics, a time when the monarchy's power was limited and the king was expected to be more of a figurehead than an absolute ruler, Perhaps, historians suggested, he threw himself into eating with the same enthusiasm he might have brought to governing, if he'd been allowed to govern. The story spread throughout Europe, where other monarchs presumably made mental notes about portion control. French courtiers, who prided themselves on culinary sophistication, were particularly amused by the idea of a king done in by what they considered peasant food dressed up in royal portions. Let us now meet Diogenes of Sinope, ancient Greece's most famous minimalist, social critic and professional button-pusher. Diogenes was a philosopher of the Cynic school, which is a polite way of saying he didn't care what anyone thought, wore the same tunic every day, and lived in what was essentially a giant clay jar. He believed in living a life free of possessions, social expectations, and personal shame. And he practiced what he preached, publicly, loudly, sometimes indecently. So how did this crusty legend meet his end? Well, ancient sources disagree, which is always a red flag in historical storytelling. But one of the most entertaining accounts claims that Diogenes died by holding his breath. Yes, voluntarily, as in, I'm done with the world, let me just not inhale again. Some say it was an act of willpower, a final mic drop in a life dedicated to rejecting society. Others suspect he was just really stubborn and possibly trying to prove a point about controlling his own destiny. Now, to be fair, there are other reported causes of his death. One version says he died from eating raw octopus. Another claims he was bitten by a dog, which, given his love for canine metaphors, feels a little too poetic. But the breath-holding theory stuck, probably because it's just so Diogenes. This was a man who once walked through the streets at high noon with a lantern, claiming he was searching for an honest man. A guy who told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, to move aside because he was blocking the sun. So yes, choosing to stop breathing because you're simply done with people fits the brand. And the best part? People respected it. The same society he mocked, challenged, and rejected ended up honouring him with a public tomb. Turns out being a curmudgeon with excellent one-liners gets you remembered. Diogenes died the way he lived, dramatically, weirdly, and completely on his own terms. Whether he actually held his breath until death, or simply refused to keep fighting whatever illness had taken hold, the message was clear. He would exit this world as defiantly as he had lived in it. The story of his breath-holding death became particularly popular among later philosophers and writers who saw in it the ultimate expression of human will and self-determination. Here was a man who had rejected every social convention, who'd lived without possessions or status, and who chose even the manner of his own death. His tomb became a pilgrimage site for later cynics and other philosophical rebels. Visitors would leave offerings not of gold or flowers, but of simple items that Diogenes would have approved of, pieces of bread, cups of water, sometimes just a handful of dirt. The inscription on his tomb reportedly read, "Time makes all things old, but your glory, Diogenes, eternity shall never destroy." Now we come to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so wealthy he made other Roman millionaires feel like part-time pottery vendors. Crassus wasn't just rich, he was obscenely rich. He owned silver mines, real estate, slaves, fire brigades. Yes, he owned fire brigades, which he sent to burning buildings and offered to help if you sold him the property first. Real estate shark, Roman edition. But he wanted more, not just gold, glory. He'd already made money. Now he wanted to be remembered like Caesar or Pompey, the kind of man who conquered something larger than a tax loophole. So in 53 BCE, Crassus decided to invade Parthia, Rome's wealthy eastern neighbour. Think of it as Rome's version of, "Hold my wine, I got this." It was a disaster. He underestimated the Parthians, who had terrifying archers, expert cavalry, and very little interest in being conquered. Crassus walked his army deep into the desert and right into a trap. Thousands of Roman soldiers were massacred. His son was killed. Morale collapsed faster than a Roman aqueduct during budget cuts, and eventually Crassus was captured. Now the Parthians knew who he was. They'd heard the legends, the richest man in Rome, a man obsessed with wealth, practically a walking coin purse. So as a parting gift, They executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. You read that correctly. The richest man in Rome died choking on liquid wealth. It was less an execution and more a performance piece, a brutal theatrical message. You wanted gold? Here, take it all the way to your lungs. Some say it's myth, others say it's exaggerated. But even if it wasn't exactly how he died, the story spread like wildfire across Rome. And that's the thing with history. Sometimes it prefers poetic justice over boring truth. Crassus's golden demise became a cautionary tale, not just about greed, but about hubris, about flying too close to the sun while holding a bag of coins. The irony wasn't lost on Roman writers, who used his death as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the folly of believing that wealth could buy everything, including military victory. The story took on mythical proportions throughout the ancient world. Poets wrote verses about the man who drowned in gold. Philosophers used his death as an example of how material possessions could become spiritual poison, and generals told the tale to remind themselves that money couldn't replace strategy, courage, or competent leadership. Even today, pouring molten gold down someone's throat remains a powerful metaphor for the dangers of greed taken to its logical extreme. Crassus achieved a kind of immortality through his death, not as the successful businessman he had been in life, but as the ultimate cautionary tale about the price of putting wealth above wisdom. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I am Spartacus," know that behind the meme and movie moment lies a man who quite literally fought until no one was left standing, including himself. Spartacus wasn't born a hero. He was a Thracian soldier captured by Romans and tossed into the brutal, unforgiving world of gladiator schools, which were less Hogwarts for fighters and more daily beatings with occasional bread. He trained, he survived, and then he rebelled. In 73 BCE, along with about 70 fellow gladiators, Spartacus escaped using kitchen knives and whatever else wasn't nailed down. Within weeks, they had defeated Roman patrols and gathered thousands of runaway, slaves and outcasts. It became a movement, a full-blown slave uprising right in the heart of Rome's pride. For 2 years, Spartacus led this rebel army. They defeated trained legions, embarrassed Roman generals, and caused panic in the Senate. And through it all, Spartacus refused to be treated like a footnote. He wasn't just escaping, he was fighting. Fact? But the Romans, unsurprisingly, don't enjoy being humiliated for long. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, yes, molten gold throat Crassus from our last chapter, who was tasked with cleaning up the rebellion before it became a full revolution. Eventually, Spartacus and his army were cornered in southern Italy. Outnumbered, surrounded, supplies running low, no escape. But Spartacus didn't surrender. Instead, he did what Spartacus always did. He fought. According to ancient sources, he charged directly toward Crassus himself, slicing through soldiers like a man who had absolutely no interest in retiring quietly. He was wounded, reportedly stabbed multiple times, but kept fighting until he vanished in the crush of battle. His body was never found. No triumphal parade, no captured king on Roman steps, just gone. And yet his story endured. Rome crucified. Over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way as a warning, but they couldn't erase the fact that a man who started with kitchen knives had nearly broken their empire's pride. Spartacus didn't just die, he refused to fall. And that kind of ending leaves a louder echo than any emperor's throne. His rebellion became the subject of countless retellings, each generation finding in his story whatever they needed, a tale of freedom, of resistance, of one man's refusal to accept injustice. The kitchen knives he started with became symbols of how revolution can begin with the most humble tools. The fact that his body was never found allowed legends to grow. Some claimed he had escaped after all, others that he had ascended to join the gods who protect the oppressed. But most simply remembered him as the slave who reminded Rome that no empire, no matter how powerful, is safe when it builds its prosperity on the backs of people who have nothing left to lose. His name became a rallying cry for rebels throughout history, whispered in slave quarters and shouted from revolutionary barricades. 2,000 years later, people still invoke Spartacus when they talk about standing up to overwhelming odds, about fighting for dignity, even when victory seems impossible. In the chaotic twilight of the Roman Republic, a time when senators plotted over wine and civil wars broke out during lunch breaks, one name flickers briefly before going out in spectacular fashion: Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus. Now, Damasippus wasn't a household name, but he was a Roman, general, and a staunch supporter of Marius, one half of the infamous Marius versus Sulla rivalry. Think of it as Rome's version of a political debate, except instead of microphones, everyone had swords and backup legions. When Sulla returned from the east with his battle-hardened army, Rome braced for impact. Damasippus, loyal to the now-defeated Marians, was arrested during Sulla's brutal cleansing of his enemies, a political spring-cleaning, except with significantly more blood and fewer dustpans. He was sentenced to execution along with a handful of other high-profile prisoners. But here's where Damasippus earns his place in our list. As he and the others were being led to their deaths, one of the condemned men began sobbing, pleading for his life, panicking. Damasippus turned to him and, laughing, said, "Why weep, fool? Did you not know what business we came here for?" And that was it. No grovelling, no final meal request, just a sardonic one-liner and a confident walk toward the blade. It's the kind of reaction that screams, "I've read the script and I don't need a rewrite." In an age when last words could be poetic, desperate, or full of regret, Damasippus chose dry sarcasm. He faced death like it was a dull committee meeting, mildly inconvenient, but nothing worth losing your dignity over. Was he a great general? Perhaps not. Did he change history? No. But he went out with more composure than most emperors, kings, or philosophers, and sometimes in history that's enough. He faced the end not with fear, but with a shrug, a joke, and impeccable timing. The story of Damasippus's final words spread throughout Rome, becoming the kind of anecdote that people told at dinner parties when they wanted to illustrate the difference between dying well and dying badly. His death became a masterclass in maintaining dignity under the worst possible circumstances. Roman writers used his example to discuss the Stoic ideal of accepting fate with equanimity, though they noted that Damasippus had achieved this through humour rather than philosophy. His final joke became a template for how to face death with grace, not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the simple act of refusing to let circumstances rob you of your sense of proportion. The execution itself was swift, as Sulla's purges always were, but the memory of Damasippus's composure lingered. In a city where political fortunes could change overnight, and where today's senator might be tomorrow's enemy of the state, his example provided a kind of comfort. If death was inevitable, at least it could be met with style. If history had a most likely to be assassinated by lunchtime yearbook, Caligula would have been on the cover in full laurel crown, smiling. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he started out promising. The Roman people loved him, the army adored him. He was the son of a war hero, raised in the imperial palace. And for a brief moment in 37 CE, he looked like Rome's golden boy. Then, the cheese slid entirely off the cracker. Caligula's reign spiraled into a fever dream of paranoia, delusion, and performance art-level governance. He declared himself a god, demanded to be worshipped as such, and famously appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a senator. Now, to be fair, the horse never attended a session, but he had a marble stable, a jewelled collar, and allegedly better table manners than most of the Senate. Caligula executed senators for blinking suspiciously, made war declarations on Poseidon, yes, the sea god, and once ordered his army to collect seashells as war trophies. This wasn't just madness, it was creative madness. Eventually, even his closest guards got tired of dodging his daily whims. His behaviour was unpredictable, his punishments theatrical, and Rome was tired of being ruled by a man who thought reality was optional. So in 41 CE, a group of conspirators led by members of the Praetorian Guard, his own security detail, decided it was time for a performance of their own. They cornered him in a corridor beneath the palace. No speeches, no poetic. Farewells, just stabbing. Lots of it. One source says over 30 wounds were inflicted. That's not an assassination. That's a strongly worded group project. His body was dumped in a shallow grave. No honours, no state funeral, Just the end of a man who once tried to replace statues of gods with statues of himself. And yet, Caligula is still remembered, not for wisdom or reform, but for turning Rome into a circus and ruling it like a fever dream. He died as dramatically as he lived, surrounded by blades, betrayed by his own, and probably thinking, my horse could have run this place better. And honestly, he might have been right. Few people in history have had a death as weirdly specific, and wine-themed as George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. Now, if the name rings a bell, it's because George was smack in the middle of England's messiest family feud, the Wars of the Roses. Think of it as a 15th century version of Game of Thrones, except with more velvet hats and fewer dragons. George was the younger brother of King Edward IV and the older brother of Richard III. Yes, that Richard III. And for a time, George was right in line for the throne. Unfortunately, George had two fatal flaws: ambition and a complete lack of self-preservation. He switched sides in the Civil War more than once, plotting rebellions, aligning with whoever looked strongest that week, and making enemies faster than a medieval tax collector. Eventually, King Edward, tired of George's constant backstabbing, sometimes literal, had him arrested for treason. Now Edward faced a problem. How do you execute your own brother without making it look like a PR nightmare? Enter the weirdest royal death solution in English history. According to chroniclers, George was given a choice in how he'd like to die. And he supposedly picked being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Let that sink in. Not gallows, not axe, not even a respectable poisoning. A wine barrel, full of it. As if he wanted his obituary to read, died doing what he loved. Was this poetic, ironic, a joke that went too far? Historians still argue about whether it really happened, or if it was a satirical flourish added later. But the image stuck, and honestly, even if it's exaggerated, it feels like something Clarence would have requested. Messy, extravagant, and mildly ridiculous. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, probably stone-cold sober by then, and largely forgotten except for the rather splashy nature of his demise. So if you ever feel like your family has drama, just remember, at least no one's been accused of treason, sentenced to death by wine barrel, and turned into England's most drinkable cautionary tale. To close out our journey of legendary exits, we arrive at a tale that proves brilliance is no defence against bad timing. The death of Archimedes, the greatest mind of ancient Greece, tragically felled by a guy who did not care about geometry. Archimedes was a mathematician, engineer, inventor, basically the kind of guy who could glance at a puddle and discover fluid mechanics. He invented levers, pulleys, war machines, and once reportedly defended the city of Syracuse with giant mirrors that reflected sunlight to set Roman ships on fire. Whether or not that last bit is true, the man was undeniably sharp. Unfortunately, what he wasn't was social. In 212 BCE, the Romans finally captured Syracuse after a long and brutal siege. Soldiers poured into the city, looting, shouting, searching for enemies. And there on the ground, bent over a diagram in the sand, was Archimedes. He was sketching, deep in thought, probably working out some eternal truth about spirals or catapults, or how many camels it takes to fill a bath. A Roman soldier approached. Now most people upon seeing a man with a sword might stand up, greet him, maybe say, "Please don't kill me," but not Archimedes. Legend says he simply looked up and said, "Do not disturb my circles." That was it. No plea, no introduction, just a firm boundary about his geometry. The soldier, either offended, confused, or simply not a fan of math, killed him on the spot, a casual, almost bureaucratic end to one of the greatest minds in history. When the ITR Roman general Marcellus found out, he was furious. He'd given strict orders that Archimedes be spared. The man was too valuable, too brilliant to waste. But alas, brilliance is no match for a confused foot soldier and a bad attitude. There's a strange poetry in it. Archimedes, the man who calculated the volume of irregular shapes and invented the screw pump, failed not by a rival genius, but by someone who probably didn't even know what a hypotenuse was. And so, one of history's brightest lights was snuffed, out mid-equation. Let that be a lesson. If you're working on a big idea, maybe look up once in a while, especially during an invasion. Being royalty came with a lot of perks: velvet robes, bottomless feasts, a private choir or two. But as King Henry the Fan of France learned in the 11th century, it didn't come with back support. Now, Henry wasn't particularly wild. He didn't ride into battle bare-chested or throw orgies in the throne room. He was a relatively steady ruler, which, in medieval Europe, made him practically a unicorn. He reigned from 1031 to 1060, dealt with some standard rebellions, raised a family, built a church here and there. Nothing too flashy, but he will forever be remembered not for what he ruled, but how he left. The story goes that one day, after sitting for a long time, perhaps in prayer, or more likely just after a really long royal meeting, King Henry stood up too quickly, and that was it. He collapsed. Possibly a stroke, possibly an aneurysm, possibly just gravity asserting dominance. Whatever it was, he died shortly afterward. To be fair, medicine in the 11th century wasn't exactly known for its diagnostic accuracy. The local physician probably waved some herbs over his chest, muttered something about bad humours, and recommended immediate bleeding. Spoiler, it didn't work. And thus, the King of France became one of the first recorded victims of what modern science might call orthostatic hypertension. That weird head rush you get when you stand up too fast and suddenly see stars. Only in his case, it wasn't just dizziness, it was the end credits. Now, you might think that dying after standing up is a little too anticlimactic for a king. But consider the symbolism. A man who ruled for decades, made it through wars, plots, and plague, brought down by a swift change in posture. It's like history whispering, even kings aren't safe from leg cramps. In medieval Japan, where honour was often measured in sword strokes and dramatic exits, Sesshu Toyo chose a quieter legacy, one made of ink, silence, and extraordinary patience. Born in 1420, Sesshu was raised in a temple, trained as a Zen monk, and like most monks, expected to follow a life of meditation, humility, and sweeping floors. Except Sesshu had a problem. He loved to draw. Constantly, obsessively, especially when he wasn't supposed to. There's even a famous story that as a child, when punished and tied up for neglecting his duties, he used his toe to draw a mouse on the floor so lifelike that the monks were reportedly startled. That's right, his detention doodles had jump scares. Sesshu later travelled to China to study ink painting at its source. He returned to Japan with a style so bold, fluid, and emotionally charged that it changed Japanese art forever. Landscapes that looked like they were breathed onto the page, mountains that seemed to hover in mist, trees with more personality than most dinner guests. He grew old painting nature and emptiness, classic Zen themes. But unlike the samurai of his age, who often died dramatically in battle or ritual suicide, Sesshu simply kept painting. And when his time came, he faced death as he faced life, with a brush in hand. Legend says that as he lay dying in 1506, Sesshu asked for ink and paper, his final act, a single bold stroke, one last line on the page. Simple, intense, mysterious. No signature, no explanation, just a brushstroke to mark the exit, as if to say, this is enough. He didn't die in a sword fight. He didn't poison himself under a cherry tree. He simply painted until the end and let the ink speak where words never could. A quiet death, but an epic one if you understand what it means to leave behind a masterpiece, in silence. So next time life feels loud, remember, Sesshu, sometimes the final word is just a line. If you've ever imagined a samurai death as noble, cinematic, and wrapped in cherry blossoms, Saigo Takamori is the man your imagination was borrowing from. Born in 1828, Saigo rose through the ranks as a hoi, brilliant warrior, statesman, and eventually a reluctant revolutionary. He helped lead the Meiji Restoration, which modernised Japan, abolished the feudal system, and unfortunately made samurai about as useful as a fax machine in a smartphone world. Many samurai adapted. Saigo did not. As reforms swept through Japan, banning swords, samurai stipends, and everything else that rhymed with tradition, Saigo became the quiet face of discontent. And in 1877, when the Satsuma Rebellion ignited, he stood at the front. It was supposed to be a protest. It turned into a war. Saigo, with a few thousand die-hard warriors, marched against the Imperial Army, a force now armed with rifles, artillery, and significantly fewer nostalgic ideals. For months they fought, outnumbered, outgunned, undeniably doomed. And still, Saigo refused to retreat. Eventually, at the Battle of Shiroyama, the final stand came. Surrounded, wounded, and watching his army crumble, Saigo turned to his remaining men. What followed is still debated. Did he commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai? Or was he too injured and asked a loyal follower to end it quickly? Either way, he died with his sword beside him, facing the future he helped build but no longer belonged to. Japan mourned him, then immediately made him a legend. The government that defeated him eventually pardoned him posthumously, raised statues in his honour, and began telling schoolchildren how noble he was, as if they'd never aimed cannons at him in the first place. Saigo became the perfect tragic. Symbol, the man who fought for honour in a world that had moved on. Sometimes you don't need to win to become immortal, you just need to lose like a legend. Jesse James wasn't just an outlaw, he was the poster child for American rebellion, the guy with a pistol in one hand and a train schedule in the other. Born in 1847 in Missouri, Jesse started out as a Confederate, guerrilla fighter, robbing Union soldiers and burning things that didn't belong to him. After the war, he figured, why stop now? And upgraded from rebel to full-time legend, leading the James Younger gang on a decade-long crime spree of bank heists, stagecoach stick-ups, and train robberies across the American Midwest. To the newspapers, he was a hero. To the banks, a nightmare. To most lawmen, a walking target with a bounty big enough to cause trust issues in any friend group. Which brings us to Robert Ford, Jesse's so-called friend and gang member, who had recently been promised a pardon and a $10,000 reward for helping. Bring Jesse in, dead or alive. In April 1882, Jesse was hiding out in St. Joseph, Missouri, living under an alias. Robert Ford and his brother were staying with him like roommates, but with more loaded weapons and fewer boundaries. On the morning of April 3rd, Jesse took off his guns, rare, and stepped up on a chair to dust a framed picture on the wall. A domestic moment, a little too peaceful. Ford took out his revolver, aimed at Jesse's back, and shot him in the head. Mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-dusting. The legend of the Wild West fell from a chair with a household chore unfinished, which feels somehow both epic and incredibly mundane. Robert Ford expected to be hailed as a hero. Instead, he was widely despised. The public didn't love Jesse because he was good. They loved him because he was bold. And killing him like that, it wasn't brave. It was convenient. Jesse James died not in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic shootout, but in his socks, betrayed by a man drinking his coffee. Sometimes history isn't a duel at high noon. Sometimes it's just someone who turned their back and someone else who couldn't resist the reward. If you've never heard of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, just know this. He wore a top hat, built half of Victorian Britain, and had a name that sounded like it should come with its own locomotive. Born in 1806, Brunel was the kind of genius who sketched bridges during breakfast and casually redefined what an impossible project looked like. He built tunnels under rivers, suspension bridges over valleys, and trains that moved faster than common sense allowed. But his biggest dream? Ships. Big ones. Really big ones. In the mid-19th century, Brunel designed the SS Great Eastern, a steamship, so massive it made other vessels look like bath toys. It was over 700 feet long, powered by both paddle wheels and a screw propeller, and designed to sail from England to Australia without refuelling. It was also unfortunately cursed from the start. During its construction, workers died. Fires broke out. A launch attempt failed twice. One man was literally sealed inside a hull panel for days before being rescued. The ship was so heavy it had to be launched sideways, which sounds cool until you realise it almost flattened a warehouse. Brunel, already suffering from stress, chain-smoking cigars like they were oxygen, had a stroke during all of this. And not just anywhere. On the ship itself, while watching a demonstration of a new engine room feature. Some say the stress killed him. Others say it was the absurd weight of expectation. Either way, he died just days before the ship's maiden voyage in 1859. And here's the kicker. On that first journey, the ship exploded. A steam pipe ruptured. 6 people died. It survived the voyage, but the dream had already cracked. Brunel's death wasn't as theatrical as a battlefield or betrayal, but it was poetic. He was undone by his own brilliance, pushing the limits of what humanity could build, and forgetting that physics and fate don't always cooperate. So while most people are buried quietly, Brunel was effectively outlived by a floating skyscraper that nearly collapsed on top of his legacy. Still, bridges stand, tunnels hold, and the hat remains iconic. Sometimes the most epic deaths happen when you dream a little too big, and reality doesn't blink. So here we are, at the end of our journey through history's most remarkable exits. We've witnessed kings poisoned by their own immunity, warriors felled by the teeth of defeated enemies, philosophers killed by laughter, inventors destroyed by their own creations, medieval monarchs done in by desserts, ancient emperors turned into furniture, and brilliant minds cut short by the most mundane circumstances. What makes these deaths epic isn't just their unusual circumstances. It's how they reveal the beautiful, terrible, absurd humanity of people who thought they were writing one story but ended up in another entirely. Mithridates, who spent his life avoiding poison, died by sword. Sigurd the Mighty, who dominated battlefields, was killed by a dead man's tooth. Archimedes, who unlocked the secrets of the universe, couldn't see a sword-wielding soldier standing right in front of him. King Martin died laughing at a joke, while Seshu died creating one last line of art. These deaths remind us that life is fundamentally unpredictable, that our best-laid plans often become our most ironic endings, and that fate has a sense of humour darker than anything we could write ourselves. But they also show us something beautiful, that even in death, these people became legends not despite their human flaws, but because of them. The paranoid king, the overconfident Viking, the absent-minded genius, the ambitious emperor, the gluttonous monarch, the flying tailor, the breath-holding philosopher, they're all us, just with crowns and swords and historically significant consequences. Their deaths teach us that dignity isn't about how you die, but about how you live, and that sometimes the most epic ending is simply the most human one. History remembers them not because their deaths were perfect, but because they were perfectly imperfect. Reminders that we're all just people trying to make it through another day, whether that day happens in ancient Greece, medieval England, Renaissance France, or modern times. The only difference is that their bad days became legends. From the stone cathedrals of medieval Europe to the philosophical schools of ancient Athens, from the courts of paranoid kings to the workshops of ambitious inventors, these stories span centuries and civilizations, yet they all share a common thread: the magnificent absurdity of the human condition. Each death, whether caused by laughter or lampreys, roof tiles or rising too quickly, teaches us that we are all gloriously, tragically, beautifully human. And so our journey through history's most unforgettable exits comes to its gentle close, like the final notes of an ancient song echoing through the corridors of time. We have walked alongside kings and philosophers, warriors and inventors, artists and rebels, spanning centuries and civilizations, each finding their own unique path to immortality through the very moments that should have ended their stories. These deaths, strange and sudden and sometimes absurd, remind us that life is precious precisely because it is fragile, that our stories matter precisely because they must end, and that the most human thing about us might be our ability to surprise ourselves, even in our final moments. From the laughter of King Martin in his Barcelona court to the final brushstroke of Seshu in his quiet temple, from the defiant sarcasm of Damasippus facing execution to the scholarly dedication of Archimedes protecting his circles, these stories whisper to us across the centuries about what it means to be human in the face of mortality. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your own bed, in your own time, with your own choices still ahead of you, let these ancient voices whisper their wisdom across the centuries. They remind us that death comes to everyone, The mighty and the humble, the brilliant and the foolish, the prepared and the surprised. But what makes a life epic isn't how it ends, it's how it's lived. Some deaths become legends because they're dramatic, others because they're ironic, and still others because they're simply beautifully human. But all of them teach us the same lesson, that our time here is both brief and eternal, temporary and unforgettable, ordinary and absolutely remarkable. Whether we're building cathedrals that reach toward heaven, solving mathematical equations, in the sand, or simply standing up from our chairs, we are all participating in the grand, absurd, magnificent experiment of being human. Each day we wake is another chance to add our own small verse to the epic poem of existence. Sleep well, knowing that you too are writing a story that will end someday, but that between now and then, you have countless opportunities to live with. The same courage, curiosity and humanity that made these ancient deaths worth remembering. The most epic thing about any life isn't how it ends, but how it dares to begin each new day with hope, purpose, and the quiet determination to matter. May your dreams tonight be filled with the wisdom of ages, the laughter of philosophers, the bravery of rebels, and the gentle peace that comes from understanding that we are all part of something much larger and more beautiful than ourselves. In sleeping, we practice for that final rest, but in waking we practice for immortality, not through grand gestures or perfect planning, but through the simple act of being authentically, courageously, remarkably human. Sweet dreams, and may your own story, however it ends, be filled with the kind of moments that make legends, not through their drama, but through their deep, abiding humanity. Good night.